Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, True Story, and thank you sincerely for being here and choosing to spend your time listening to this story today. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever sat at a table surrounded by family, sharing what looks like a perfectly normal holiday meal, only to realize that a single quiet sentence can change the way you see everything and everyone in that room? What would you do if the people who believed you depended on them had never once noticed the quiet ways you had been holding everything together? Today's story begins with a moment just like that. A simple family lunch that slowly revealed something none of us were prepared to see. And if you stay with this story until the end, I promise you will walk away with a deeper understanding of people, of family, and of the quiet experiences that shape who we become. The afternoon it happened looked ordinary in every possible way. It was a winter holiday lunch at my mother's house in Portland, Oregon. Outside, the pale grey light of the northwest winter pressed softly against the windows, and the bare branches of the trees shifted slightly in the cold wind. Inside the house, warmth filled every corner. The smell of roasted turkey drifted through the dining room, mixing with cinnamon and butter from the apple pie cooling in the kitchen. The table was crowded with plates, glasses, and bowls passed back and forth in the familiar rhythm of family gatherings. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 35 years old, and 2 years before that afternoon, I had been running a small financial consulting business that I believed would support my future. When a major contract collapsed, everything I had carefully built began to unravel faster than I expected. Moving back into my mother's house was supposed to be temporary, while I rebuilt my life. At least, that was the story everyone around the table believed. That afternoon, my family sat together the way we always did. My mother Margaret at the head of the table, calm and composed. My sister Emily beside her, describing something ridiculous that had happened at her bakery earlier that week. My uncle Robert laughing loudly, his voice echoing slightly against the dining room walls. Forks touched plates, glasses shifted across the table. Everything felt easy and familiar. Then my mother cut a piece of turkey, looked directly at me, and said something that quietly changed the meaning of that entire afternoon. "Daniel," she said in a calm voice, "I think it's time you stopped relying on the family." In that moment, no one else stopped eating. Yet something invisible had shifted in the room, like the first thin crack appearing in the foundation of a house that everyone thought was perfectly steady. What would happen if the person everyone quietly believed was dependent on the family was actually the one holding everything together behind the scenes? That thought followed me as I slowly pushed my chair back from the dining table. The sound of the chair legs brushing the floor felt strangely loud in the middle of the ongoing conversation, yet no one really looked up. Emily was still talking about the bakery. Uncle Robert reached for another piece of turkey. My mother continued eating, as if nothing important had just been said. I murmured a quiet, "Okay," though I am not sure anyone heard it. Then I stood and walked down the hallway of the house I had known for most of my life. The hallway carried the same small details it always had. Framed photographs along the wall, the faint smell of wood polish, the worn place in the carpet near the guest room where years of footsteps had softened the padding. I stepped over that familiar dip automatically and pushed open the door. My suitcase was still sitting open at the foot of the bed. I had never completely unpacked when I moved back in. Years of business travel had taught me to keep things ready, just in case life required me to move again. I knelt beside the suitcase and began folding my clothes with steady, careful movements. Packing did not feel rushed or dramatic. It felt methodical, almost reflective, like quietly putting a life chapter back into order. As I folded the last sherd, memories surfaced in calm fragments. After my father passed away, the property taxes on the house had suddenly increased, and I arranged a payment plan with the county office that allowed my mother to keep the house without ever worrying about the details. Later, when Emily's bakery oven failed and the bank refused her loan, I signed the guarantor papers for $40,000 so she could reopen the shop. There were other things too: insurance premiums, additional mortgage payments, small financial systems quietly running in the background. None of it had ever felt like a burden. Sometimes you help simply because you are there. When I finally closed the suitcase and pulled the zipper around its edge, a quiet realization settled in my mind. Maybe my mother was right. It was time to stop relying on the family. The only thing she did not know was who had really been carrying the weight. What happens when a quiet truth enters a room and suddenly every familiar thing begins to feel different? That was the moment waiting for me when I lifted the suitcase and walked back toward the dining room. The zipper had closed with a soft final sound behind me, and somehow that small sound felt like the end of something much larger. When I stepped back into the room, the lunch looked almost unchanged. Plates still held half-eaten food. The smell of roasted turkey and warm bread lingered in the air. Yet the moment I rolled the suitcase beside my chair, the conversation faded in a subtle, uneasy way. Uncle Robert looked up first, his expression tightening slightly. "Going somewhere?" he asked, the question hanging between curiosity and confusion. I rested one hand on the back of my chair and answered calmly. "Mom is right," I said. "It is probably time I stopped relying on the family." A few quiet nods followed, the kind people give when they believe they understand what you mean. They assumed I was agreeing with her, but I continued before anyone could return to their food. "So I will be moving out this afternoon." Emily paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. The room did not erupt into questions or arguments. Instead, something subtler happened. The atmosphere shifted, like the moment before a storm, when the air pressure changes and everyone senses it without speaking. I kept my voice steady. "Before I go, there are a few financial details you should know." No one interrupted. "The additional mortgage payments on this house will stop after this month," I said. Uncle Robert frowned. "What payments?" I continued evenly. "The home insurance has also been paid through an account I created after Dad passed away." Emily slowly placed her fork down. I looked toward her gently. "And the loan for the new oven at the bakery required a guarantor. That guarantor is me." Silence settled across the table, deep and complete. It felt like the moment when the electricity disappears from a building, and everyone suddenly realizes how many invisible systems had been running quietly in the background. I let the silence remain for a second before adding the final piece. "All of those payments," I said softly, "will stop next month." What happens when the person everyone believes is dependent suddenly reveals that he was the quiet foundation holding everything together? The moment those final words left my mouth, the entire dining room seemed to change shape around them. My mother was still holding her fork slightly above her plate, as if time itself had paused halfway through the motion. She stared at me, confusion slowly replacing the calm certainty she had shown earlier. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice thinner now, no longer steady. I answered, in the same composed tone I had used all afternoon, not raising my voice, not accusing anyone, simply explaining. I described the account I had created after my father passed away. The insurance payments that had quietly kept the house protected. The extra mortgage contributions that helped stabilize the property when expenses rose. I explained the bakery loan and the guarantor's signature that allowed Emily to replace her broken oven when the bank would not approve the funding otherwise. I spoke only in facts, numbers, and simple explanations, like laying out pieces of a puzzle that had always existed but had never been seen together. No one interrupted. The room grew still in a deeper way, the kind of silence that appears when people begin reconsidering years of memories and suddenly see them through a different lens. My mother lowered her fork slowly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. I gave a small nod, not defensive, simply honest. "Because you never asked." The words stayed in the air longer than I expected. Emily stared down at the table. Uncle Robert no longer smiled. For a moment, I felt as if the house itself was weighing the past, recalculating the quiet years no one had noticed. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, I turned back once more. "For what it's worth," I said gently, "I never felt like I was relying on the family." Outside, the winter air was sharp and still. I walked down the driveway while the house behind me remained silent. Sometimes, dignity does not come from proving anyone wrong. Sometimes it comes from walking away and letting absence reveal the truth. Thank you for listening to this story. And perhaps in the next chapter, we will discover what happened when that silence inside the house finally began to speak.